So now we move on to our next school of thought, the Atomist school of thought. Our two famous atomists are going to be Leucippus and Democritus. Now, Leucippus is going to be one of these people that we know almost nothing about. So we're going to quickly just give a quick sketch on him, give the little bit that we know for sure, and then we're going to go into Democritus. Now, chances are a lot of what we say Democritus did, Leucippus really did, but there's just no way for us to know. So, as a convention, you typically just attribute everything to Democritus and say it could have been a lot of him too, but we just don't know. So we'll crash through Leucippus real quick and then focus on the philosophy when we talk about Democritus. Leucippus, we're not positive where he was from. Some people say he was from Miletus. Other people say he was from Elea over in Italy. But where he is famous is up here in Abdera. And this is where he does most of his work. So we call him Leucippus of Abdera, and Democritus is also going to be from Abdera, the same place. So back away from Athens a little bit. Remember that Anaxagoras was just barely down here in Athens. So born in Miletus or Elea, we don't know. There's arguments going both ways. You'll see why some people think he has a lot of Parmenides in him. Other people says he has a lot of Anaximenes in him. Most people argue because of the Anaximenes that he was most likely born in Miletus, because that's where Anaximenes was from. Most notable for being teacher to Democritus and being the father of atomism. Now, give you a quick high-level view of what atomism is. When you phrase it up, or when you sum it up in a single phrase, the phrase you use is, all that exists are atoms in the void. All that exists are atoms in the void. And to give you a crude picture of what they mean by atomism, imagine we go and we get Parmenides' one solid sphere of being, complete plane, and we stick it in this void of complete empty space. So you got infinite empty space, and here's Parmenides' sphere. And we take a sledgehammer type thing, and we just break it up into a bunch of pieces that are now all randomly moving throughout the universe. These little solid pieces of being that are uncuttable, can't split in half, atoms. Unchanging, Parmenidean little balls. That's roughly the atomist picture of the universe. So that's a crude way of phrasing that. Now, he's also going to be our first explicit mechanistic materialist. And we still call him a pluralist because his RK is going to be atoms, and there's going to be an infinite number of atoms. So he's a pluralist, but he's our first mechanistic materialist. So let's break down each of those words and understand what they mean. Materialism, what's that? It's the view that matter is the fundamental reality. Anything non-material is simply a derivative to be explained entirely in physical terms. Everything can be explained simply through physical matter doing physical things. Second, mechanism. Everything happens according to the laws of mechanics. Now, obviously, he wouldn't know the laws of mechanics. It's just implicit in his theory. It took Newton to first state the laws of mechanics. So, mechanism is the view that everything happens according to the laws of mechanics. It is contrasted with teleology, the idea that purpose is operative somewhere in the universe. So he's going to be expressly opposed to Anaxagoras' view that minds can operate with purpose. No, they can't. That's going to be their view. Note that these two together are typically seen as implying strict determinism. Strict determinism is the idea that there is no free will, that everything that's going to happen is going to happen. From the beginning of time, it was predetermined everything that was going to happen. And you never really make a choice. Free will is a complete illusion. It was predetermined that you were going to shake your hand one way and move your hand another way, from the very beginning of time. A more teleological view, when you go and you get a drink of water, would be that you were thirsty. You decided, I'm thirsty. You had a purpose in mind. You went and got a drink of water. These guys would say, no, no, no. What was happening is with time, the water was evaporating out of your body, and it was causing some other jiggling, which causes some other jiggling, which ultimately made your body start moving in such a way that you got up, grabbed the water, put the water in, and stuck it up to your lips and drank it. There was no purpose in mind. You never made a choice. That was predetermined from the instant, they would say the instance of the Big Bang, but to bring more modern time, from the instance of the Big Bang, it was predetermined that at that exact time, you would get up and you would get a drink of water. You never had a choice about it.
Are you even a thing? Like, is the concept of you
It will be for him. We're going to see a lot of inconsistencies with these guys early on. They're going to want to say some stuff, and then they're going to completely go against it some other way. But giving you the outline of their thought and what they're going for. Now, specifically related to Leucippus, the only fragment we have extant is that nothing happens at random, all happens out of reason by necessity. Here he means that there is no choice. Your choices would be random. I can't know ahead of time what you're going to do. Everything happens by necessity. It was predetermined from the beginning of time.
Isn't necessity kind of like the logos?
Logos is kind of like necessity. Remember that necessity is this old thought all the way back in Greek mythology.
Yeah.
It's over the gods, it's over everything, and everything happens according to necessity. Now, that far back, they didn't have this idea that necessity is ruling with an iron fist dictating everything that you're going to do. It's no matter what kind of choices you make, it's ultimately going to work towards necessity's benefit. And so, in that way, it's like you're more guided in the path you're going to take than actually every choice that you're going to make. So I might direct you to go out of this classroom. I don't know exactly every step they're going to take, but I know that you're going to start out here and you're going to end up there. And the details in between not as important. That's a more Greek version of necessity prior to each philosopher giving their own position on it. Does that make sense?
His necessity.
Necessity guides the general path. It doesn't specify every detail.
And he thinks it's just all happenstance or predetermined.
He thinks it's all predetermined. It was predetermined that you were going to step with your left foot at that exact time in that exact location from the very beginning.
Okay.
All predetermined. Complete determinants. So that was all we know for sure about Leucippus. He obviously contributed a lot to the theory, but we're just going to move on now to Democritus before we get into the theory. So Democritus of Apollonia, same place, 460 to 370 BC. Notice that he's actually younger than Socrates. Socrates was 470. He lived longer. But we still call him a pre-Socratic because he's continuing these same pre-Socratic ideas. So that's why we're covering him now, even though chronologically speaking, he would come later. So, while contemporary Socrates, we still include him with the pre-Socratics. If you were to Google pre-Socratics, he'd be one of the people that came up. He's said to have written between 52 and 60 works, but it's more likely that some of these were written by his master Leucippus, and others were written by students of his, where it was all ultimately just attributed to him. Kind of like the Pythagoreans attributed everything to Pythagoras. But, regardless of that, we do know that he was a prolific writer. He did write a ton. Unfortunately, none of his works are extant. Go ahead.
If we don't have any of his works, how do we know how all these guys, how they've written this many works?
So, fortunately for us, Aristotle, a lot of the times when he goes and he takes on the topic, one of the first things he does is he'll explain what all the great thinkers before him had to say on the topic. And then he'll give his criticisms, take what he likes, put aside what he doesn't like, and then go on elaborating his own ideas. Now there's other people who did that like Aristotle, but Aristotle's the main source for a lot of these guys. That's why I talk about Anaxagoras. We mostly gave Aristotle's quotes. And he had access to those materials when they were still extant. So it's your second-hand references to their materials a lot of the time that we reconstruct their philosophies.
They were in existence at one point.
Yes, in particular with Leucippus and Democritus, they start this Atomist school. They're going to have a follower, Epicurus, who's going to write works where he's encoding basically their same ideas. So that helped preserve it. And then you're going to get a Roman by the name of Lucretius, who also translated a bunch of Epicurus's works from Greek to Latin. And so Epicurus, who's ultimately a follower of Democritus, was very well preserved compared to a bunch of these guys. So that's one of the other secondhand ways that this stuff all gets preserved.
Okay.
What's extant?
Still in existence. Okay, so seems to have been a polymath, wrote works on ethics, physics, mathematics, music, and cosmology. He's also a mechanistic materialist, just like his teacher Leucippus, and he's also a pluralist, thinks that there's multiple one-stuffs, namely atoms. Go ahead.
What does music mean in this context? Is it like
The continuation of music theory, most likely.
So it's not the muses.
No. I think it's music, actual music.
They had music back then, like music theory.
Yeah, Pythagoras was one who kicked off music theory. And then he's also known as a laughing philosopher, and he emphasizes being cheerful in his ethics and was apparently a very pleasant person to be around.
Is he the first person to do ethics that we've covered?
Is he? No. Well, I guess Heraclitus did politics. But we're definitely going to get more into his ethics than we did any other particular person's.
Well, who's the father of ethics? Is that just...
Yeah. Talking about how you ought to behave, remember that that was the primary form of education prior to philosophy. Prior to demonstration, there was just, this is how you ought to behave. I mean, that's what the Iliad and the Odyssey are teaching you. Your lessons of behavioral patterns. You should do what this guy did. Don't do what this guy did.
That makes sense.
All right. So, atomists. Resetting up the problem and the atomist approach to the problem. So, Empedocles says that he doesn't have being coming from non-being, since everything is just different combinations of the four elements. That's what Empedocles says. And it's just through their motion and the different combinations that we get all the change in the universe. Only some qualities are real, according to Empedocles, namely the qualities of the elements, hot, cold, dry, and wet. And the other qualities are somehow derivable from these. Not sure how, but somehow they're supposed to be. Anaxagoras says that Empedocles still has being coming from non-being, since he has bananas coming from non-bananas. Fire, water, earth, air. And he has the qualities of bananas coming from hot, dry, cold, wet. Doesn't make sense. Since we experience all the qualities we experience, they must all exist. So that's what Anaxagoras thought. This is what Empedocles thought. Empedocles says some of the qualities exist, and Anaxagoras says no, all of the qualities exist. What are the atomists going to say? None of the qualities exist. So Empedocles says some qualitative properties are real, while Anaxagoras says all qualitative properties are real. The atomists take the view that no qualitative properties are real. Atomists say we have to be careful. We got to distinguish between two types of properties. They don't use these names, qualitative and quantitative. Those are terms now used in philosophy, so that's going to be the terms we adopt. I'll explain exactly what Democritus was said a little bit later. But so they say we got to be more careful and we got to distinguish between two types of properties. The qualitative properties and the quantitative properties. What are your qualitative properties? These are things like smell, taste, temperature, color. There's an infinite number. We could list them all. Or we can't list them all. And then there's the quantitative properties. Now there's only 3 quantitative properties, or 4, a little bit of argument there. But they are size, shape, motion, and weight, maybe not weight, so asterisk there. But for sure these 3, size, shape, motion. These are your quantitative properties. Why do we now call them quantitative properties? They're things that you can measure, you can assign a quantity to. So quantitative properties, ones you can measure, you can assign a quantity to. The qualitative properties are all those other qualities that exist in the object. The atomists are going to argue that only these properties are real, none of the other ones. No qualitative properties are real. No such thing as hot, dry, cold, wet. No such thing as red. No such thing as banana taste. These aren't real things.
It's amazing that they can come to their realization.
So, the qualitative properties, they're going to say exist by convention. That's the word that they're going to use. Qualitative properties exist by convention. They are artificial human constructs dependent upon humans for their very existence. In other words, we're going to say they only exist in human minds. Color, not real. It only exists in human minds. Size is real. Taste, not real. Only exists in human minds. Position, that is real. So, qualitative properties exist by convention. The quantitative properties now, they exist in nature. They are objective and exist independent of humans. If you get rid of humans, there's no more red. If you get rid of humans, this atom is still as big as it is. That's the reason. So this distinction between properties. Now, every atom has the quantitative properties. Every atom has a size. Every atom has a position. Every atom has a motion. And maybe a weight. And that one had an asterisk to it. Debate back and forth on that one. And so every atom has the quantitative properties, and only the quantitative properties. There's no such thing as a red atom, or a cold atom, or a sweet atom, etc. Qualitative properties are not real and only exist in the mind of the observer as a result of atoms in the world interacting with atoms in your body. So somehow, through some interaction of atoms in your body and atoms in the real world, you get these sensations, but they're completely subjective to you. Give you one of their examples. Imagine that I get 3 buckets of water. One is at boiling point, one is at room temperature, one is just about freezing point. If I have you stick your hand into the hot bucket and then stick it into the room temperature bucket, they'll say, oh, how cool. If I have you stick your hand into the freezing bucket and then stick it into the warm bucket, the room temperature bucket, you'll say, oh, how warm. So what is a bucket really? Is it cold or is it warm? So this is one of their arguments for it's just dependent upon the observer. It's not really one or the other, it's just your experience of it. So hot, it's not real. Cold, it's not real. That's just your subjective experience.
What if it's boiling your hand off?
It doesn't matter. It just so happens, well, the room temperature water can't boil your hand off, right?
Yeah, the boiling.
The boiling one, the fact that the atoms are moving in such a way that causes your hand to boil off, okay. Maybe there are some things that you, me, and everyone else can agree, no, that feels hot. But maybe there's some other species out there that they can stick their hand in and say, no, that feels quite comfortable. So what is it really? That's what they're going to be saying here. So Democritus' most famous little sentence. By convention, sweet. By convention, bitter. By convention, hot. By convention, cold. By convention, color. But in reality, atoms in the void. That's all there really is. Atoms in the void with their 3, maybe 4 properties.
It's impressive.
Yeah,
I don't know how this guy
cool how they
could
came up
possibly
with
figure
this.
this out.
Yeah.
Okay. So, there's your all the appearances of new qualities, namely colors, tastes, odors, come into being and passing away. Those things coming into being and passing away are purely due to different combinations and rearrangements of atoms with their varying quantitative differences. Size, shape, motion, weight. In other words, all qualitative differences can be explained purely quantitatively, with nothing new actually coming into existence or going away. It's just the way you are experiencing the different quantitative properties of these different atoms. They admit there are qualities coming to be and passing away, but since these qualities only exist in the mind, they are not real. So we are not violating Parmenides.
But what about if you I remember talking about Parmenides that thinking about something is it coming into being?
Not thinking about it, is it coming into being? But all thought is about being. Being is the subject of thought, and since you can't separate thought from being, then they have to be one and the same.
So, if they're
I mean, you're starting to notice some of the issues with this. So for one, they're saying all the qualities exist in the mind. Okay, does the mind exist then? If you kind of press them on the logic of their thinking here, they're going to ultimately say, well, no, there's no mind because everything's that physical stuff. So the qualities exist in the mind, but there is no mind. So where are the qualities? And why is there the experience? And they're going to run into this problem. They got this completely deterministic view. We're going to see by the time they get to their ethics are going to be pretty much make good choices. According to your metaphysics, there's no such thing as a choice. And yet your ethics is saying make good choices. So there's going to be a lot of ways that they're inconsistent with themselves early on. This is a first pass at atomic theory like this. So you're going to notice those types of inconsistencies. Okay, so other turn. They agreed that there being motion implied that there was non-being, the void. So since motion is an obvious fact, there must be void. They have no problem allowing the void to actually exist in reality, and they don't view this as violating Parmenides. Why do they not view it as violating Parmenides? Because you never have what is becoming what is not, nor do you have what is not becoming what is. So what is they're going to call atoms. They're going to say atoms are eternal, always existed, exactly as many as there are. An atom never diminishes any, it never gets any bigger. And so that's what being is, all the atoms. And so you never have an atom turning into void, or a void turning into atom. So there's being and there's non-being. But we never have being becoming non-being, and we never have non-being becoming being. So they think they're good here. Now, why did they have to reintroduce the void? Why couldn't they do motion the same way that Empedocles and Anaxagoras did, and say that the whole universe is full of atoms? And it's because of some Parmenides' own arguments. Remember now, their atoms are just being with no qualitative differences. So I can't have being next to being unless they're actually connected and they're one and the same being. Sorry, that didn't draw very well. I can't have an atom here and an atom here with no empty space between them. Otherwise, the two atoms would be connected and would really be one atom. See, the reason that Empedocles and Anaxagoras were able to say this, they were saying, look, I can have fire here and water here, and why are they not really the same thing? Because they have different qualities. These guys are saying, no, there are no different qualities. And so, we can't have being next to being like this, otherwise all the atoms are going to be combined into one, and we're going to be back to Parmenides. So we have to allow the void to exist. That way we're going to get motion, and atoms can move in the void. So that's why they can't explain it the same way that Empedocles and Anaxagoras did. Okay, so agreed that there being motion implied that there was non-being, the void. So since motion is an obvious fact, there must be the void. Non-being must exist. Nothing must exist. Empty space that things can move in. Also, since there's a variety of things, there must be more than one atom. You're one thing, I'm another thing. Which means you have at least one atom, and I have at least one atom. And so there has to be more than just one atom. So those are two basic arguments against Parmenides. Look, motion's obvious, and there being multiple things is obvious. So there has to be atoms in the void. Okay, so therefore both being, namely atoms, and non-being, the void, actually exist. And they're going to be the fundamental constituents of the universe. Note that we never have the same thing both being and not being, so we do not have what is becoming what is not, or vice versa. Because atoms never turn into void, and void never turns into atoms. It's just the atoms moving around.
Can you explain that butterfly example using the atom theory?
Using the atom theory?
Yeah. Tim turning into
Okay, so you got Tim the butterfly, or Tim the caterpillar, right?
Yeah.
And what starts happening to him? He's composed of all the atoms that he's composed of, and there's other atoms out here. And as those atoms interact with Tim the butterfly, they keep interacting in such a way that he slowly turns into what you start seeing before you. It looks less and less like a caterpillar, starts looking more and more like a butterfly. Through the random collision of atoms. It's just all combined together, and you get a butterfly then. So it's the same atoms, some from other places in space, like the leaves of the caterpillar ate or whatever else, but they're just recombining themselves in such a way that now it's a butterfly. And so if we were to account for all the atoms, they're all now just in a different position, moving in different ways. All the atoms that made up that caterpillar, and all the leaves that it ate along the way, if we go after the change and get the butterfly, we can hunt down each of those atoms and see where it came from. And it was there in the beginning. It's just a reordering of them. And they're just moving different than they were before. So in that way, the atoms were always there. It's just different combinations of atoms coming into being, going away. Some came from the leaf, and now they're in the caterpillar, turning into the butterfly. Some went away, and now they're somewhere else. But nothing new actually came into existence or went out of existence. Okay, Aristotle on these guys. Leucippus and his associate Democritus hold that the elements are the full and the void. They call them being and not being, respectively. Being is full and solid. This is your atoms. Being is full and solid. Not being is void and rare. Since the void exists no less than body, it follows that not being exists no less than being. Atoms exist, being exists. The void exists, or non-being exists. The two together are the material cause of existing things. Aristotle, when he uses this word material cause, he means what physically causes something. If I got dominoes falling over, the material cause of this domino falling over was a previous domino that hit it. So it's just a physical chain reaction that leads to something happening. That's what he means by material cause. So the two together are the material cause of existing things. Ultimately, they will cause it to come into existence. And just as those who make the underlying substance one generate other things by its modification, and postulate rarefication and condensation as the origin of such modifications, like Empedocles and Anaxagoras did, in the same way, these men too say that the differences in atoms are the cause of other things. They hold that these differences are three. This is how atoms differ from each other. The only three ways atoms differ from each other: in shape, in arrangement, and in position. Being, they say, differs only in rhythm, touching, and turning, of which rhythm is shape, touching is arrangement, and turning is position. So I could have one atom, could have some shape like this. It's a solid thing with, some hooks coming off like this. And I could have some other atom, a nice vertical sphere thing. The only way that these things differ from each other, this one's bigger, it's got a different shape. This one's smaller, and they're in different positions. But all atoms are composed of the same stuff, namely being. So they're all made for the same stuff. This is the only way that they differ from each other: shape, size, and position. And possibly weight, if you include weight in the picture. So all that exists are atoms in the void. Each atom is an eternal, minute, unchanging, indivisible plenum of being, sometimes referred to as a Parmenidean one, each individual atom. It's its own little Parmenidean one. Note that atom means indivisible. So these things can't be split up. And this is one of the ways that they avoid a bunch of Zeno's paradoxes. A bunch of Zeno's paradoxes have to do with infinitely dividing something up. They simply say, doesn't apply, can't infinitely divide it up. You're cheating. All atoms are composed of the exact same stuff, namely being. There are infinitely many atoms differing from each other in shape, in the same way that A differs from B. Those two letters have very different shapes. They differ from each other in orientation. the same way that n differs from z. Notice if I take n and tip it up, it's a z. And differ from each other in position. AH, swap their position, you have HA. That was some of Aristotle's examples. Some say that weight was also a fundamental property of atoms. Others say that individual atoms have no weight. So, argument there. Now, they are all randomly moving around in the void. Now, I say randomly because it's not really random. If you could see exactly where every atom was and exactly how they're moving, you could determine exactly how they were going to move next. So it's not really random. It could have been predetermined from the beginning of time. It's random in the sense that when you see a bunch of billiard balls moving around on a table, it looks random. But really, if you watch through every billiard ball and how they were coming together, you can figure out exactly how it was going to bounce off. So that's why the randomly in quotation there. They are all randomly moving around the void, non-being, colliding together to produce the appearance of things coming to be and passing away. Enough atoms stick together, you got the butterfly. And eventually they decay and fall away, and now the butterfly's not there anymore. And we say, poor Tim died.
Without Einstein understand what these philosophers were saying and use it as inspiration?
The man who introduces the atomic theory in modern times is Boltzmann. So Boltzmann's the first one who introduces it in modern times. And his story is kind of a sad story. He introduced atomic theory. At the time that he introduces it, this would have been mid-1800s-ish, maybe a little bit later. He's absolutely ridiculed by the scientific community. And to the extent that you can make the argument, it looks like he was driven to suicide because of that. Ends up committing suicide. And I think it's about 10 years later that Albert Einstein ends up vindicating him. One of the things Albert Einstein proves is he validates Boltzmann's view of atomic theory.
Using mathematics.
Well, it's Brownian motion if you want to go look at what exactly it is.
I watched a video.
Okay, yeah. So Einstein, he's one of these people, he was at the forefront of everything. Atomic theory, he's there. Quantum mechanics, he's there. General relativity, forget he was there, he did it. I mean, there's a reason that we say we use Einstein as synonymous with genius. It's just crazy how he was at the forefront of everything.
I'm just curious if the modern hypothesis, who was the first guy?
Boltzmann was the first one to introduce it in modern
Did
times.
he perhaps look into philosophy to
Oh, I'm sure.
because I mean they're still using the same term.
Yeah, so they picked up this term when atomism finally caught on. They thought that the atoms that you make up your periodic table with were actually indivisible solid pieces of being.
Yeah.
Until Rutherford, I think, is the first one that realizes actually these things have substructure. And it's not this solid thing of being. But there's actually a nucleus and then some sort of cloud of stuff going on around it. He thought of electrons. I'm not sure if he's the one who thought of the electrons. I think it's Bohr who finally says electrons, maybe they're orbiting around. And so work was done and found out actually these atom things are not very stable and they decay and they split all the time. And eventually we utilize that and create something called an atomic bomb. So, yes, when it was first introduced, the reason they assigned atom to it is because they thought, okay, we found it. Fundamental pieces of reality. There it is. Not by a mile.
Do we have a new kind of
String. Yeah, string theory. You have to take string theory. There's 4 theories in the running right now, but one of them is string theory. Everything's composed of teeny, 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 tiny strings. Now, it's hard to get a sense of how teeny tiny these strings are. One of these teeny tiny strings to an atom is way smaller than the atom is to a visible universe.
String theory is not discrediting the existence of the atom, is it?
No. It's just getting down to what's the fundamental constituent. Because obviously it's not the atom.
Oh.
Your atom is made up of protons, neutrons, electrons. You look at the proton, it's made of the up quarks and the down quarks. So if you're trying to get down to the fundamental what's everything composed of, I think the most popular theory in physics for the past half century now has been string theory. And it's ultimately little vibrating strings.
And they can't be divided.
And they can't be divided.
There's no like prominent.
I don't want to say it like that, but
There's no prominent theory that denies atoms.
no.
Modern. Okay, just curious.
Atom turns out to have been a bad name. But yeah, there's hydrogen, there's oxygen, there's these elements on our periodic table. There's no denying them.
Okay, I'm just
Yeah, chemistry is studying these things. That's what the field of chemistry is. Studying chemicals, ways you can put together atoms.
There's 4 running theories in physics right now. You mentioned that there are 4.
There's 3 other ones. Doesn't matter. I don't want to go off too much on tangent. So, back to here, atomism. I can't remember where we were. Did we go over the slide or were we just starting it?
We're just sorry.
I think we just started. Okay. Since all atoms are the exact same stuff, namely being, completely solid being, the observed differences in material must result from the shape, size, and arrangement of atoms. Possibly weight. The atoms stick together via their varying shapes. How do these atoms stick together? Have you ever, you know how Velcro works?
Yeah.
You have one side that just has a ton of hooks. So on one side of the Velcro, you got just a ton of hooks sticking out, hooks sticking out, hooks sticking out, hooks sticking out. And then on the more material-filling side, you got a bunch of these loop things. And you just shove the two together, and some of the hooks get stuck in some of the strings on the other side. And that's Velcro, right? And it causes them to hook together. Now, it's not that this plastic over here fused with the plastic over there. They're still separate from each other. They're not actually hooked together. They're not actually touching, maybe I should say. They're not fused. They're still two separate things. But it's just through the way that they're intertwined that now it's kind of tough to pull them back apart. So this is going to be his view of atoms. Atoms are not these nice spherical-looking things. They're these monstrosities. Some of them are nice and spherical. Others of them have hooks going all over the place. You don't want to see an iron atom. You know how hard it is to pull iron apart? Those atoms must have lots of hooks and things that can grab on, and they must be really big and hefty. You can't get those things to budge. Try and rip a piece of iron in half. On the other hand, cotton atoms, those things are pathetic, hardly hooking together at all. So you can get them to create these bonds and break these bonds. It's very much like Velcro that they see this. So by the time you talk about water atom, well, water doesn't really stick to itself very well. So water atoms, they must be mostly smooth, mostly spherical. They have to have some hooks coming off. Because, you know, you take a glass and you can always fill up the glass a little bit more above the rim. The water can always bubble up above the rim. So water does stick to itself some. So it must have some hooks, but not very well, so it's mostly spherical. And that's their way of viewing how these things stick together. It's kind of like Lego blocks sticking together. All these atoms are like Lego blocks. Two Legos don't actually fuse together to form a new piece. It's just the way you connect them together. It's just a friction holding it all together. That's all it is. So, explaining different weights of things. So a small stone and a cotton ball, both are the same size, they have very different weights. How do they have very different weights if they're both just composed of being? Well, there's way more, the density on the stone is way more than the density on the cotton ball. Cotton ball, it's mostly full of void, so I can squeeze it into almost nothing. Lots of void in there, not as much being, so that makes it lighter. A stone, try compressing a stone, see how small you can make it. It must have hardly any void in it, so those atoms are very closely compact together. And so that's why it's heavier. So that's explaining some of the different weights. So we always describe all change as coming to being and passing away. And so if you can come up with some theory that explains how it looks like things are coming to being and passing away, then you've got the change that we care about in the universe. And you're considered to have solved Heraclitus' problem. So that's how they think they solved Heraclitus' problem. Give you some of the direct quotes. This comes again from Aristotle, I believe, on what they thought. And hopefully you see how he talks about this picture. As they, the atoms, move, they collide and become entangled in such a way as to cling in close contact to one another. But not so as to form one substance of them in reality, of any kind, whatever. So they don't actually fuse, but they just kind of hook onto each other. For it is very simple-minded to suppose that two or more could ever become one. Simple-minded to assume that they actually fuse together. The reason he gives for atoms staying together for a while is the intertwining and mutual hold of the primary bodies. For some of them are angular, some hooked, some concave, some convex, and indeed with countless other differences. So he thinks they cling to each other and stay together until such time as some strong necessity comes from the surroundings and shakes and scatters them apart.
Is that Aristotle saying that?
That's Aristotle saying that, describing their theory. Note that since atoms are indivisible, we've already talked about that. That's a bad place to have that. Anyway, so hopefully you got a sense for how these atoms actually stick together and how things come to be and pass away. How does a plant grow? These atoms are randomly coming together, hooking. But then after enough time, they start jiggling off from each other. And so it starts decaying. And so the flower comes into being, and the flower passes away. No actual atoms came into being or passed away. It's just them hooking together and then unhooking. That makes it look like something new actually occurred. So that's how they explain all change. The atomists still claim that there is a soul. However, the soul is composed of soul atoms. So the soul atoms are completely spherical. They're the smoothest, the smallest, the rarest of atoms. These ones are really hard to hang on to. Your soul atoms. Now, you got to have enough soul atoms in you for something to be alive. You got to have even more soul atoms in you for something to finally experience consciousness. Consciousness is somehow having enough of a concentration of these soul atoms inside of you. Now, these soul atoms are tricky things. They're always trying to get out. And so we have to, all day, keep trying to get more soul atoms into our body. If you don't hang on to them, eventually you pass out. You lose consciousness. You need a certain amount of soul atoms to hang on to that consciousness. And if you go long enough without breathing, you die altogether. Because the soul atoms just keep escaping you. If I got you standing here and I suddenly decapitate you, the soul atoms come pouring out. You're gone, just like that.
So could you resurrect somebody by giving them more soul atoms?
By trying to pump the soul atoms back in?
Yeah.
It's really hard to get a hold of these things. I don't know how you would do it. Maybe, CPR sometimes works. I don't know. I don't know all the details of how these things would work. But yeah, so here you are, you're awake. No matter how hard you try, eventually you just can't hang on to those soul atoms. And enough of it's going to get out of you that you're no longer conscious. And so we call that sleeping. And as you're there sleeping, you're breathing, and eventually you're going to get that combination back enough that you wake up again. Sometimes through random chance, you're going to be walking around throughout the day, and just through random chance, a good amount's going to flood out of you. And we call that passing out.
So it's like you.
But don't worry, since you're still breathing and still alive, you'll eventually get them back in you and be conscious
You
again.
use them up as you're conscious.
It's not that you're using them up, it's that they're constantly escaping you. Because your body is completely porous, because it's all of these atoms just hooked together. And soul atoms are the smallest and the finest. So it's real easy for them to get in, and it's real easy for them to get out. And so you got to constantly work to maintain them in there. All right, think we talked about all that. Now, on the atomist view, no such thing as an afterlife. When you're gone, you're gone. Your soul atoms will eventually go, spread out, decay, and spread into everything else. Just like your body atoms will eventually decay and spread into everything else. Nothing lasts forever. Even the gods, in their view, are composed of atoms, and they too will eventually decay. The earth, for them, will eventually decay. In fact, this is the infinite earth that we're on. There were infinitely many earths in the past that randomly came into being and passed away, came into being and passed away. And the process is going to keep going on. Human beings coming into existence, completely random. Their explanation for humans, not too great. They seem to think that it came from a slime. I'm not sure the argument for the slime, but some slime and pretty suddenly humans came out.
Like completely just slime to human? Or
It seems like a very fast process. It's not like
evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, Empedocles was a bit different, right? He thought randomly some ears came into existence and toes and fingers and, a bunch of fingers joined together and that created some species, a bunch of arms and other species, and randomly human beings came into existence. And since we were able to exist in this world and reproduce in this world, we're to a point where there's only human beings now. And all these other weird combinations, they died off because they weren't stable enough to reproduce. So he gave a better theory of evolution. There seems to be a regression with respect to that. All right, perception. Perception now is going to be very similar to Empedocles. Remember Empedocles' version of perception? You constantly have water, fire, earth, and air jiggling off of you, and those go into my eyes and are known by the earth, air, water, fire, and me, and that's how I experience you. They're going to be very similar. So the random motion of an object's atoms causes its outer shell to be in a state of constant decay, no matter how slight. Your outer atoms are constantly decaying off of you and coming out. The outer atoms coming off of the front of you, some of them are jiggling their way through, and they eventually get to my eyes. And it creates some sort of jiggling that gets all the way back to my soul, which causes me to see you. And since it's only the atoms jiggling off the front of you that are coming to my eyes, I only see the front of you. The atoms jiggling off the back of you are going that way. And so someone else sees the back of you. I can't see the back of you because those atoms aren't jiggling off into my eyes.
So photons were atoms in their perspective.
Everything. All that exists are atoms in the void. It's not a notion of light carrying something. It's all through physical jiggling. It's those atoms hitting my eyeballs, causing a jiggling of the atoms inside of me, ultimately causing some jiggling in my soul atoms. And my soul atoms are the ones who actually finally have that experience.
But you don't get wet when you look
You can a little bit. It's very slight decay. And so a little bit of water is getting into your eyes as you're looking at the ocean.
You also can't see someone if it's dark. So how would you...
How do you explain that?
Yeah, how would you... even they're still jiggling atoms. Why would they stop jiggling atoms if there was no light?
That's a good
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
Weird.
Yeah. Very weird. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I'll have to think about that. There might be something for it, and I'm just ignorant of what it is. They probably have some explanation. Anyway, so these decaying atoms are carried through the air and travel into our eyes, carrying that outer shell image, and that's ultimately how I'm able to see you. The impact of the atoms on our sense organs is what enables us to perceive the decaying object. The collision with my sense organs creates a string of internal collisions and motions, ultimately moving our soul atoms so as to be conscious of the image of the atoms we are seeing. So it's ultimately motion in our soul atoms that is all our conscious experience. And so when I touch this, there's some communicated motion all the way through to my soul atoms, which finally makes me feel the texture of the thing. Or it makes me smell the scent of something, or see something. So all these other qualitative properties are just motion of my soul atoms. And my sense organs just help to move those soul atoms. Alright, so the atoms coming off of objects further away from us have to travel through more air to reach me. So I can see you okay right here. If I put you back far enough away, that outer shell decaying off of you has to travel through a lot of air. And some of those atoms, they just get knocked off course as they're trying to come to my eye. And so I only get to see some of them. And so it's harder to see you the further away you are. And the closer you are, the more atoms are getting into my eye, the better I can see you. Our awareness or experience of objects is ultimately just a certain jiggling of soul atoms. I get your soul atoms jiggling just right, you see red. I get your soul atoms jiggling just right, you feel sharp. All qualitative properties, then, are really just a jiggling of soul atoms in a particular way. And so in this way, these qualitative properties don't really exist. They can be described simply in terms of our atom's motion. They can be described as a certain type of atom, certain size, certain shape, having a certain motion. And so we reduce all qualitative perceptions, all qualitative properties, to really these quantitative properties of atoms. In this way, all the qualitative properties are reduced to quantitative properties. Red is nothing more than a certain type of motion and a certain type of shape of a certain type of atom. That's all it really is. Their cosmogony, not really worth going into. It's pretty much the same thing as an Anaxagoras is. It starts out with air, and as things become more condensed, those atoms start to have different properties that we experience. So really spread out atoms are going to feel more like air. If you get them more condensed, they start to feel like water or earth or whatever. So similar to Anaxagoras. Now their epistemology. How does it we know things? Since in reality there's only atoms in the void, and since it is impossible to have any direct sense experience of either of these, truth is difficult for us to know. Of truth, we know nothing, for truth is a well. Giving you one of his direct quotes. Since the majority of our experiences are the qualitative properties of an object, and since these exist in the mind alone and not in reality, they're just a jiggling of soul atoms, he views almost all knowledge as insufficient and subjective. Just because that's how you experience that thing doesn't mean that's how I'd experience that thing. Just because it causes your soul atoms to jiggle that way does not mean it will cause my soul atoms to jiggle that way. So a bunch of this is going to be subjective or insufficient to come to conclusions. He's still going to argue that reality is largely an illusion. It's not really the way it seems to us. But we in actuality grasp nothing for certain, but what shifts in accordance with the conditions of our body and the things, the atoms, which enter it and press upon it. That's how we have the experience of it. Those atoms coming into our body and pressing upon us. So, while he is very critical of the senses, he being Democritus here, while he's very critical of the senses and their inability to give us accurate information about reality, he does not do away with sense perceptions completely. Because without our sense perceptions, we would lose our foundations for our basic assumptions of motion and multiplicity. Remember, he starts by saying, look around you. Motion is an obvious fact. Look around you. Multiplicity is an obvious fact. And that's how he started his whole argument for the atoms in the void. It was based off of sense perceptions. So he's not going to do away with them completely. He's just going to say they're mostly unreliable. They give you a starting point, but from there you kind of just have to reason about reality yourself. And you can't really rely on your senses to give you accurate information about the world as it actually is. That make sense? But without our sense perceptions, we would lose our foundations for our basic assumption of motion and multiplicity. Give you one of his quotes. Miserable mind. You get your evidence from us, the senses, and do you try to overthrow us? The overthrow will be your downfall. So you can't get rid of sense perceptions completely. They give you your starting point for your mind to start reasoning from. All right. That ends his metaphysics. We'll start with his ethics, unless you have any questions about his metaphysics, about this atomic view. All right. We'll get to his ethics. Warning. I could have given you the ethics of some completely different random philosopher, and you wouldn't know the difference. His ethics is going to be completely incoherent with his metaphysics. He's not going to talk about you as though all soul, he's going to argue that soul is better than body. He's going to argue that you have choice. He's going to assume all these different things. And so it's going to be inconsistent with his metaphysics. Just giving you a warning. So, as with most mechanistic materialists, the good life is found via obtaining pleasure and avoiding pain. This is the one way that he's going to sound like a mechanistic materialist. All mechanistic materialists go down the same vein. However, it's difficult to put together a coherent view of his ethics, and even harder to reconcile it with his view of determinism. So we're going to have some contradictions. The best way for a man to lead his life is to have been as cheerful as possible and to have suffered as little as possible. And that's going to be pretty much his thesis. Be as cheerful as you can, experience as much pleasure as you can, and avoid as much pain as you can. Those two things together, that's what constitutes a good life. That's what you should aim at. While a materialist, he still seems to have a hint of a soul-body dichotomy, placing the soul above the body. Somehow think about the soul as trapped in the body, and you should focus on the things of the soul, not the things of the body. So he's still going to do that bit. Give you one of his first quotes here. It is right that men should value the soul rather than the body. For the perfection of soul corrects the inferior of the body, but physical strength without intelligence does nothing to improve the mind. So you improve the mind, that can help you improve your body, but if you just go out there and improve your body, it does nothing to help your mind. So he says. Studying medicine not only does it help your mind, it can also help you know how to take care of your body. Going and getting ripped doesn't help you do any more algebra. It doesn't help you understand medicine any better. That's what he means there. He's not talking about preserving your mental health to preserve your physical health to help your mental health, but that's what he's talking about. While pleasure is a criterion for a happy life, he holds that some pleasures are better than others, and that one ought to pursue the moral pleasures. Now, how in his philosophy do you decide one pleasure more is better than another? He doesn't really have a good hierarchy that he can use, since he's saying it's just material things. And so you should just be going off of the pleasure. Nonetheless, he's somehow going to come up with this hierarchy. So the cheerful man, who's impelled towards works that are just and lawful, rejoices by day and by night, and is strong and free from care. But the man who neglects justice and does not do what he ought, finds all things disagreeable when he remembers any of them, and he is afraid and torments himself. So you might think, under his philosophy, I should pay honest taxes. If I cheat this way, I could get an extra $1,000. And I can use that $1,000 to go buy a really nice dinner, nice meal for myself, and thereby experience more pleasure. So under his philosophy, I should do that. He says, no, no, no. The pains of worrying about the government finding out that you underpaid them and coming after you is going to outweigh the pleasure you get from that dinner. So pay your taxes. I give you a sense for his argument there. Happiness does not dwell in flocks or in gold. The soul is a dwelling place of the genius of good and evil, the creative power of good and evil. So it comes from the soul. Again, hard to reconcile with his atomic view, but that's what it is. One must not respect the opinions of other men more than one's own, nor must one be ready to do wrong if no one will know, more willing to do wrong if no one will know, than if all will know. One must respect one's own opinion most, and this must stand as a law of one's soul, preventing one from doing anything improper. So always act as though everyone will know in all your actions that you do. More men become good through effort than by nature. again, one completely contradictory to his idea of determinism. If everything's predetermined, doesn't my nature completely dictate all my behaviors? And he's saying, no, put some effort into changing yourself. Completely inconsistent. It's one of the problems with the deterministic view that any philosopher tries to take on. It completely throws ethics in the garbage. How can you say someone ought to do something other than what they did? They could only have done what they did. Getting after someone for stealing is like getting after a rock for falling. It's stupid. You can't change a rock's behavior. It's going to do what it's going to do. You can't change a person's behavior under determinism. They're going to do what they're going to do. You're going to do what you're going to do. Everyone is. So it makes ethics break down. So there's a reason that he's inconsistent with himself. It's really hard to have a deterministic ethics. Only fools are shaped by gifts and chance. Only fools are shaped by gifts and chance. So if inheriting a ton of wealth suddenly changes your life, or suddenly losing some wealth suddenly changes your life, you're one of these fools. Give you a little bit of an example then. I don't know if I had an example already up here. Give you just an example of what he would say. So you might think, here you are, and you won the lottery. So now you have access to all this money. You might think, I need to maximize my pleasure, so I'm going to go develop these expensive eating habits and start eating more expensive food. We're going to assume that more expensive means you get more pleasure out of eating the food. Under his view, that's a very foolish thing to do. You were already content eating the food that you had. And now you went and got that more pleasurable food. Yes, you have it. But now if I take that food away from you, you're now going to experience pain. And just as easily as you won the lottery, some misfortune can befall you. And now you can lose that money, and now you can't afford that nice meal anymore. And so the pain of not being able to afford that nice meal far outweighs the pleasure of eating that nice meal. To give Bertrand Russell phrasing of this, most people, if you just understood the basics of his philosophy, would think that he would argue, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. His philosophy would actually be, don't eat, drink, and be merry, otherwise tomorrow you'll die. And it's not worth it. Or you'll have some health condition down the road, and the pain of that aren't worth it. So control yourself.
More long term is his concern.
Yes.
That makes sense.
So that's what he means here when he says, only fools are shaped by the gifts of chance. Alright. So the cheerful life is not found in having an abundance, but rather in limiting our desires and focusing on what is possible for us to have. One of the things he says is, if you ever feel like what you have isn't very good, always look for someone more misfortunate than yourself and compare yourself to them. And then you realize, compared to them, I do actually have it pretty good. So try to be content with what you've already got and try and find ways to get pleasure in what you've already got. The key to true pleasure is moderation. Moderation in all things. That's what he thinks maximizes the pleasure. Because that way you avoid the most pains. So we're trying to maximize pleasure and avoid pains. It's a balancing game. And so moderation is what's going to do the most to help us avoid all pains. And then we can still maintain the pleasures that we just enjoy in our regular life. Eating expensive food, example already done. Alright. Failing to be moderate leaves you beholden to chance. If you get used to something, chance can come along, take that thing away from you, and now you experience pains of not having it. Souls which are stirred by great divergences are neither stable nor cheerful. So don't allow your soul to be stirred very much by one thing or another. Almost sounds a little bit stoic there.
Yeah, it does.
Alright. One must give the highest importance to the affairs of the state, that it may be well run. One must not pursue quarrels contrary to right, nor acquire power contrary to the common good. The well-run state is the greatest protection, and contains all in itself. When this is safe, all is safe. When this is destroyed, all is destroyed. Understand that he's growing up in city-states. A well-run city-state is the best thing you can have to preserve your own good life. So make sure your state's taken care of so that the affairs of your personal life can be taken care of. If the state falls into ruin, your personal life's going to fall into ruin. If a tyrant's able to come to power, that's going to have negative effects for you. So help the state be well maintained. Justice is what should be done. Injustice is the opposite. Those to whom their neighbor's misfortune give pleasure do not understand that the blows of fate are come to all, and also they lack cause for personal joy. So if you're getting pleasure out of your neighbor's misfortune, you're failing on two fronts. One, it's not their fault they're having the misfortune, and that could just as easily happen to you. And two, you must live a really sad life that lacks all personal joy if you're getting joy out of your neighbor's misfortune. So, while Democritus' ethics make no promises, he doesn't say any of these things will for sure guarantee you a happy life. He does, however, list 3 keys to maximize your chances of living a happy or cheerful life. And those 3 things are: 1, moderation. Be moderate in everything you do. 2, personal responsibility. Put effort into things that you know you should do, not so much into the other things you should do. And then finally, be just in your state. Follow the laws, obey the laws, support your state. Those 3 things together, and you maximize your chances of living a cheerful life. But again, there's no guarantees, because the randomness of fate is the randomness of fate. And whatever will happen to you is whatever will happen to you. And that pretty much sums up the Atomists. Now, we have one more guy to talk about. Well, any questions about the Atomists or atomism before we go to this last guy?
Yeah.
The last guy will be almost nothing, so.
Isn't Democritus the guy who dies laughing?
Yeah, he's a laughing philosopher, right?
He was known as a laughing philosopher. I don't know how he died. No idea.
Why is he known as the
After
laughing
making
philosopher?
guesses, it seems like he was
It was very cheerful.
He was known to have a very cheerful demeanor, and it's what his ethical philosophy advocated. Live a cheerful life.
Guy to hang out with.
Yeah, he seems like someone that it would have been a pleasure to hang around. Interesting guy. You like his ethics. His
Yes.
metaphysics is interesting.
He had some pretty cool, like, accurate ideas, though.
Which is really impressive.
Great
His
guy.
metaphysics.
In his metaphysics,
Well, his
yeah, you can see how the ideas that we use are all evolving with all these ideas. So,
You didn't seem to mention in ethics that they were kind of based off of what your objective, conscious objective was. Did he mention any of that, by chance?
oh, about a purpose you might have?
Yeah, like
He said that you are more formed by effort than you are by nature. So the things you put effort into would presuppose some purpose, some goal in mind.
But wouldn't that kind of be the basis for building ethics, is to first determine what the goal is?
Right. So the whole point there is, if you're going to have an ethics that revolves around some goal, some purpose, then that's going to introduce teleology. His metaphysics is completely material, mechanistic determinism, which doesn't allow for any type of purpose. You never go and get a drink of water because you're thirsty. It's just all the jiggling of all the things happen to bounce on you in such a way that suddenly got you moving in such a way that you walked over, grabbed a glass of water, happened to put water in it, happened to hold up to your mouth, happened to swallow. And that was all predetermined from the beginning of time in their metaphysics. In his ethics, he's saying, control yourself. You may have that urge to go, steal that guy's gold, don't do it, bad idea. You got to be just. You might enjoy spending that gold, but you're going to be worrying about them finding out for the rest of the time. It's not worth it. And if they do find out, the pains that come down, even worse than the worrying you had. And the worrying itself wasn't worth it. So, it's very hard to reconcile those 2 things together.
Why did he have such a contradictory view?
Remember that none of his works are actually extant.
Yeah.
So maybe there's some interpretation, some way of reasoning through it, where we could actually come up with a way that puts these 2 together. Because a lot of what we impose upon Democritus is just what his philosophy ultimately led to. Maybe Epicurus is more to blame for some of the inconsistencies we're noticing than Democritus himself. I don't know. Or maybe Aristotle's in some sense to blame. I don't know. Or maybe there really just was this inconsistency.
So he was quite open to the realization that maybe there's more than atoms, but as far as I can tell, this explains the majority of our physical experience.
I don't know what he was open to. He's
He never
in his
mentioned it.
metaphysics, they say pretty defiantly, all that is atoms in the void. That's it. And the only properties the atoms have are these 3, maybe weight. So, I don't know. It's a common point of discussion how he could have had these 2 opposing views, but the best we can do to put it together is there's these opposing views. They're just not coherent with each other. So, last one I wanted to just briefly mention is Diogenes of Apollonia. This is not the Diogenes that you're thinking of, if you know that name.
Yeah.
Apollonia is somewhere up there. The only reason we're going to briefly mention him is because the author of the textbook does, in case you're following along with the textbook. If you're not, he's pretty much the exact same as Anaximenes take Anaximenes and Anaxagoras and put them together. Anaximenes, remember, is one who thought that everything was air, and everything comes into existence through rarefication and condensation of air. Take Anaximenes' air, endow it with Anaxagoras' nous, or mind, and you got this guy's view.
Why would he? Why?
So that way you get the motion in the universe. He basically wants all of Anaximenes' metaphysics, and now he wants to explain initial motion. And he's going to take Anaxagoras' nous.
So why did he combine it with air instead of having it as a separate thing? Like, why not have the mind as separate from air rather than saying that air?
Well, now he's just going to be very similar to Anaxagoras if he tries to do that. So he just mixes the two together. Somehow everything has a little bit of consciousness, and the more of it you get together, the more consciousness you have, the more mind you have. So everything's endowed with a little bit of mind. The more condensed something gets, the more mind it has. Don't have a lot on how he can piece together his philosophy. I don't know if the Earth is somehow supposed to be conscious now, because it's got a lot of matter together, and so it must have a lot of mind. I don't know. So he's more of a side note, but just touch on him since the author did. So recap of our big guys that we've now talked about so far. The ones who have a rippling effect throughout philosophy from here on out. Obviously, Thales is the one who kicked it all off. The one stuff is water, but you start out looking for the one stuff. Pythagoras, what did he say the one stuff was?
Numbers.
Numbers. But he's the first one that actually starts looking for mathematics in nature. And thinking that math somehow has to describe all of nature. If you can use math to describe this vibrating string, what can't math describe? If math can describe music, what can't it describe? And so it's going to be people that follow Pythagoras and Pythagoreans who make a lot of early physical discoveries. Kepler was a Pythagoras, or a Pythagorean. Kepler, as in the one who figured out that planets travel in ellipses. And he figured out the rate at which they go around. In Kepler, he has his 3 equations. And why was he even out looking for these equations? Because he's a devout Pythagorean. And so these numbers have to describe it. He's after Copernicus. We're talking about 2,000 years after Pythagoras. There's still Pythagoreans. Kepler was one. And he made these discoveries simply convinced that you have to be able to describe nature with numbers. And now it's the only way we know how to do it, just about. And it started out with the blind faith of these Pythagoreans.
Forget about Illuminati, you got Pythagoreans.
You're right, that's something.
And then Heraclitus, he's the first one to argue against logic. Fortunately, he doesn't catch on until much later in time, but yes, a lot of later philosophers actually argue against logic. Parmenides, famous for asserting logic, and then finally Democritus for establishing the atomic theory.
That's so awesome because they all had some fundamental truths in their mix of religion.
Yes, all their ideas persist today,
That's so cool.
in some way. Yeah, so that's often the quick summary I give of history of philosophy. What are you saying? You're studying a history of the evolution of ideas. You're seeing where they ultimately came from, the arguments formed, and how those arguments evolved into the ideas that exist today. So, any other questions? That's all the material I'm going to try to cover today. Not going to move on. Let you know what's coming up. The Sophists are next. So these are the people that Socrates is going to be addressing. If you're interested in it, like not Pythagoras, Protagoras, Gorgias, those guys, a bunch of the Sophists you can now find out about in our primary resources are going to be Plato's dialogues. So that's what we're going to be moving to now. To give you briefly their names.
Is Thrasymachus one of them?
Yes, Thrasymachus is one of them. So here's the 4 major Sophists we'll ultimately be talking about. Protagoras, Gorgias, Prodicus, and Thrasymachus.
How many more philosophers until we just talk about Socrates?
Socrates is arguing with these guys, so he comes right after these guys.
Right after.
So a bunch of Plato's dialogues is portraying these guys' views, and then portraying Socrates' counter-argument to their views. So in studying the Sophists, you also are studying Socrates and Plato, because they're the response to him.
What does sophist word?
Sophist? The etymology of sophist is a wise man.
I love sophists. They're so wise.
So it just means a wise person. So the Sophists were supposed to be wise people that went around teaching for money, your youth. And they trained to be a wise youth. Now they got a negative reputation, and so Sophist now has a negative connotation. And so you might know terms like that's just pure sophistry that we use today.
Were they skeptics or something?
They're going to be the origin of skepticism. Yes, that's exactly where we're going. Any other questions? Wonderful. See you next week.
Thank you.
Very welcome.